皆様、こんにちは。本日は緊急セミナーにご参加いただきましてありがとうございます。まだ参加者の方が続々入室されていますので、もうしばらくですね、お待ちいただければと思います。はい。では、それでは、時間になりましたので、始めさせていただきます。本日は緊急セミナー、韓国政府がバイオマス発電への補助金を停止削減、日本の政策に求められることとはを開催いたします。ご参加いただきありがとうございます。本日司会を務めさせていただきます、地球人間環境フォーラムの鈴島と申します。よろしくお願いいたします。このセミナーは、主催、地球人間環境フォーラム、協力団体として、ブータン森と生活を考える会、バイオマス産業社会ネットワーク、マイティアース、熱帯林行動ネットワークで、開催いたします。日本ではですね、再生可能エネルギー固定価格買取制度によって、気候変動対策、再エネとして国内で推進されてきたバイオマス発電ですが、認定を受けた発電容量のうち約8割が輸入燃料に依存する大型の発電所です。韓国でも再生可能エネルギー証書という政策によって、バイオマス発電が太陽光や風力よりも大きな補助金で支援され、燃料の多くをベトナム、マレーシア、インドネシアなどの東南アジアとカナダ、ロシアからの輸入に頼ってきました。韓国と日本はアジアにおけるバイオマス発電燃料の一大輸入国として、大きな市場として拡大してきましたが、昨年12月に韓国では2025年1月以降のすべての新規バイオマス発電所及び既存の国営混焼発電所への補助金の停止、また既存の発電所へのですね、補助金の段階的縮小といった大幅な政策変更が行われました。日本を含めバイオマス発電を支援してきた国は、これまでもですね、燃料の持続可能性に関する基準などを設けてきましたが、補助金そのものの大幅な見直しに踏み切ったのは韓国が初めてです。えっと本日のセミナーではですね、当団体がこれまで協力してきた韓国の気候 NGO、Solutions for Climate のハン・セソン氏に、韓国がバイオマス発電の補助金停止、削減に踏み切った背景と、その内容を解説していただきます。続いて、日本や欧米の政策、生産地や業界の最新動向を紹介し、コメントをもらい、日本と世界のですね、政策が今後どういうふうに変わっていくべきか考える場にしたいと思います。本日のプログラムはこのようになっております。はい。本日の資料はですね、この後、チャット上でもご案内いたしますし、当団体のウェブサイトにもですね、後ほど掲載させていただきます。はい。質問は Zoom の Q&A 機能を使って受付していただきます。講演の最中に書き込んでいただいても構いません。質疑応答の最後の質疑応答の時間で取り上げさせていただきます。はい。では、まず最初に、Solutions for Climate のハンセソン氏に、韓国政府がバイオマス発電の補助金を削減というタイトルでご講演いただきます。それではよろしく。
Thank you, Tsurushima-san. And Thank you, Global Environmental Forum, for making this very important and timely event happen. As introduced, I am Hanse Song with a Korea-based climate advocacy organization called Solutions for Climate. And I'll be talking about the recent policy changes that we saw in December in South Korea regarding the biomass energy use in the country. Next, please. So I'll be going over a series of topics, but of course, I think we need to talk about the issues with biomass and how the Korean subsidy policy is structured first, and then we'll talk about the actual changes to the program. And then I'll then end the presentation with what this actually means to the global forests and the biomass industry in South Korea and the potential for the industry in the Asian region at large. Next. So before we begin, to briefly introduce to you Solutions for Climate, as I said before, we are a climate change nonprofit based in Seoul, South Korea, with the goal of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that we're seeing all over the globe. So we try to work with our global network, like these amazing partners we have in Japan, and also bring in people and strategies that are innovative and effective in addressing the climate crisis. Next. So let's begin, and let's just briefly talk about why stopping the large-scale deployment of biomass energy matters in addressing the climate and biodiversity crisis. Next. So we all know that climate change is here and it's happening right now, and much of that, well, all of that is because of our greenhouse gas emissions that are increasing the concentration of those gases in our atmosphere. And to mitigate these greenhouse gas emissions, we need to transition our energy away from fossil fuels to renewable sources like wind and solar. That's a common sense. But what's also important is protecting and restoring our natural world. And this is the graph that's put together by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which shows that protecting and restoring nature has much climate change mitigation potential as wind and solar. That's why protecting nature is important to mitigate the climate crisis. Next. But sadly, the world is severely off track to end deforestation by 2030, despite the global pledges and promises the governments have made. And much of the deforestation happening around the world is actually attributable to forestry in the global north and commodity production in the global south. And by commodity production, we mean clearing of natural forests for the production of palm oil, soy, cocoa, beef, and coffee, and all these agricultural products that we use every day. Next. And this is where East Asia comes into play because South Korea and Japan, these East Asian regions are becoming the new demand centers for biomass. And by biomass, we mean felling of forests to produce fuels and burning those fuels in power plants. And this is a graph from our the latest global assessment of the growth of the biomass industry worldwide. And as you can see, that compared to 2023, in 2030, South Korea and Japan will be some of the largest incinerators of rainforests in the forms of wood pellets. So that's why mitigating biomass is important in mitigating forest loss globally. Next. So that was the brief introduction to the subject matter. And I'll just talk about the state of biomass power in South Korea, where we are at, and how the subsidy policies are structured. Next. So this is how each renewable source is doing in South Korea lately. And sadly, we don't really have that much renewable energy in the first place, which is hovering at around 7 to 8% nationwide. And of that renewable energy, roughly 18% is bioenergy, and much of that bioenergy is solid biomass. And 73% of all this biomass electricity comes from forest biomass, which means the burning of wood pellets and chips directly sourced from forests to generate power. So biomass is important when it comes to our electricity mix, when it comes to our renewable energy mix. And sadly, this is the point where all the deforestation happens. Next. And unlike genuine renewables like wind or solar, by definition, biomass needs to burn wood. And much of this wood, it comes from natural forests, standing forests out there in the mountains. And of course, felling these trees, pelletizing them, chipping them, processing them, and importing them across the ocean, and eventually burning them in power plants emit a lot of carbon dioxide. And actually, carbon dioxide emitted from biomass burning at the point of combustion is more than fossil fuels when you compare it by the unit of energy produced. So that's why biomass cannot be carbon neutral and it cannot be a solution to the climate crisis. Next. And by biomass, I mostly mean large-scale biomass, utility-scale biomass that we commonly see in South Korea. And because our biomass, the size of our biomass power plants are so big that we actually rely most of our wood pellet demand on imports, just like similar to Japan, South Korea imports 82% of our wood pellet demand. And even those that are produced domestically within South Korea, often referred to as unused forest biomass, or the industry likes to call it forestry residues, 87% of those residues are produced through destructive clear cutting. So whether those pellets are from other countries or sourced within South Korea, there are huge sustainability issues associated with. Next. And this graph is a little more complex than the ones before, but the basic takeaways here is that when the biomass power industry first started in South Korea, it was mostly biomass and coal co-firing done by public power utilities, the power plants that are owned by the government. But as the time passed, now we're seeing more and more privately owned power plants burning only biomass in their generators. So we're switching from more publicly owned co-firing to more privately owned biomass-only firing in the country. And the graph on the right shows how what kind of fuels that we're burning in South Korea. And as you can see that the red parts are imported wood pellets, and the blue parts are domestic forest biomass. So again, we're relying heavily on imported feedstocks, and much of the domestic feedstocks that we're burning are actually labeled as forestry residues. Next. And then let's talk about the policy that supports biomass power in South Korea. As was briefly mentioned before, Korea has renewable portfolio standard, unlike the feed-in tariff or feed-in premium in Japan. So basically, the way RPS works is that big fossil fuel power plants are mandated to produce a portion of their energy from renewable sources. So these coal power plants can either build their own solar or wind farms or purchase renewable electricity from other renewable energy producers in the form of what is called as renewable energy certificates, RECs. So from the biomass producer's perspective, they can burn wood, make electricity, and they can sell the electricity and of course get paid. but they can also sell their REC credits on the market and make additional revenue as well. So that's how most renewables, including biomass, become profitable in South Korea. Next, please. And the RECs are there because renewable energy is generally more expensive than fossil fuels in South Korea. So RECs are there so that renewable energy producers can make additional revenue to offset their high cost of generation. But also, renewable energy sources have different costs associated with them. And ironically, burning wood, biomass, is one of the most expensive kind of renewable energy you can get. So that's why biomass is subsidized even more heavily. They receive even higher multipliers to those weightings and to those RECs, and we call them weightings. Biomass receives weightings that are higher than solar or onshore wind, just because burning wood is more expensive. And of those biomass, domestic forest biomass receives the highest weightings of all because sourcing that kind of wood from within South Korea is prohibitively expensive without these government subsidies. Next. So that was the brief background, and let's finally talk about the actual reform of the REC weightings that happened in December last year. Next. So this is the stated reasons for the reform of the government subsidies, and these are direct quotes from our Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy, or MOTIE for short, in South Korea. So basically, MOTIE publicly announced that biomass is too expensive, its generation cost is too high, and also because biomass is subsidized so heavily through REC weightings, is increasing the competition for wood resources even within the timber industry. So more and more wood is being diverted to the biomass power plants because they're subsidized. That means that power plant and wood pellet producers are sourcing their wood at higher prices, and that leaves other timber industry businesses like furniture manufacturers and pulp manufacturers left with very few options for their need of wood. And lastly, of course, there are ongoing issues with forest degradation and carbon emissions that are repeatedly, of course, brought up by the civil society. So these are the three reasons that our MOTIE laid out for this revision. Next. So these revisions are very complex just because of the nature of how South Korea's biomass subsidy program is set up, but it can all boil down to four main takeaways. First of all, there won't be any more RECs issued for new biomass power plants. And second, biomass power plants that burn only biomass, so the dedicated burning, will have their subsidies phased down over the course of time. And third, biomass, the subsidies for biomass co-firing will be phased out. So for dedicated burning, it'll be phased down, not a complete elimination, but for co-firing, it'll be a full end of subsidies, starting with utilities that are publicly owned by the government. And lastly, domestic forestry residues, the wood pellets and chips that are produced under the name of unused forest biomass within South Korea will have their REC subsidies remained unchanged. Next. So let's go each four of these points one by one. The first of all, new power plants. Starting in 2025, new biomass power plants will no longer be eligible for RECs. So this signifies that the government sees that we don't need more biomass in our energy mix. We already have plenty. We already have our expected capacity, and we just don't need more of these power plants entering our power market and taking up space in our renewable electricity mix. So it also means that biomass will start to play increasingly, a little less and less of a role going into the future, because other renewable energy will grow and biomass will either stay or diminish in the longer term. Next. But also this decision comes with a little bit of caveats. The power plants that are already being constructed or that have attained the business license already are considered existing power plants, not new power plants. So there's a few of them in the pipeline, and this will be built in the next coming years. So that's a little bit of a catch here. Next. Now let's talk about the existing power plants. And first, let's talk about dedicated biomass. So the REC support for dedicated biomass will decrease over time. But for public power plants, it'll decrease more rapidly. It'll be reduced more rapidly over the next 3 to 4 years. And privately owned power plants will see their ratings decrease more gradually, because the government has set up this reduction curve for REC weightings to be very heavily backloaded, so that much of the reductions happen toward the end of the lifetime of a power plant. So this means that we'll continue to see more wood getting burned in these dedicated power plants. Next. So that's the downside of this decision, because most power plants will receive most ratings until the plant reaches 18 years of operation, and then we'll see this dramatic drop in their subsidies. Next. Now then, let's talk about co-firing. Co-firing in existing power plants. So starting this year, public power plants will no longer receive RECs for co-firing. And as you can see, the graph on the bottom right, the red line is the public utilities, and the REC weightings they're just going to end this year. But for privately owned co-firing power plants, the reduction curve is more generous, it's more gradual. And as you can see that for most power plants, the point in time where it actually reaches zero REC weighting will be around in the mid 2030s. Next. So the issue is this is a very symbolic move to completely end all subsidies for co-firing. But the issue is that co-firing, the publicly owned co-firing facilities only take up 10% of South Korea's biomass power fleet. And of course, this heavily backloaded phase out for privately owned power plants delay the phase out schedule. And seeing this wood being burned with coal into the 2030s is just simply not acceptable from a climate and biodiversity point of view. Next. So this is the biggest problem with this reform last December. It's the domestic forestry residues. As I briefly talked about, all these existing power plants can retain their high weightings, the highest weightings, by burning domestically sourced unused forest biomass fuels, whether it's for dedicated burning or co-firing. This shows that the intent of the South Korean government behind the subsidy reform is to promote the domestic wood pellet and wood chip industries, not necessarily really curbing the overall demand for biomass. Of course, because South Korea relies so heavily on imported wood pellets, we expect to see a gradual decrease in the overall demand for biomass fuels, but this pivot to the domestic forestry resources is likely to end up in increased pressure on our own domestic forests, more intense and aggressive clear cutting, and of course, carbon emissions, whether they're sourced from, whether the wood is sourced from our domestic forests or imported from other countries, will be the same. And also, this policy change does not touch burning waste wood. We call this biosolid refuse fuels, bio-SRFs in Korea, or biomass fuels that are made of other plants, such as palm kernel shells. Next. So that was just a summary of these changes in policy, and let's talk about what led to these changes. Next. First of all is the role of media. And over the years, we're seeing increasingly more coverage on forest degradation happening in South Korea, largely for the production of biomass fuels. The picture on the right shows how destructive clear cutting is decimating our forest ecosystems in South Korea. And of course, practices like this can't go unnoticed by the public and the press. And the media also also starts covering how this zero emissions of biomass on paper is not actually zero emissions or carbon neutral. So all this coverage got fed into the decision-making people at the government, and this certainly served a role in reducing the overall support for biomass. Next. The second is the policymaker consensus on co-firing, that this type of biomass burning is just not renewable. You are entrenching the life of the coal power fleet that needs to be phased out anyways, because we have to move away from coal and start making more renewables. And burning wood in those power plants is just not the type of technology that we want to invest in and that we want to pour our renewable subsidies in. And since 2017, policymakers, whether they are from the parliament in Korea or from the government watchdog, have pointed out that we are subsidizing co-firing, or it actually does not reduce any greenhouse gas emissions. Next. And the third is a bit of an irony here, because the Korea Forest Service, which represents the needs and the voices of the forestry sector in Korea, is really heavily focusing on promoting the domestic wood chip and wood pellet industries. And because these domestic wood chips and pellets are competing with imported wood pellets, promoting the Korea Forest Service has channeled their effort on promoting the domestic ones instead of the imported ones, which means that we're seeing more and more domestic wood pellets being produced, on the other hand, and imported ones going down. Next. And the fourth one is the increased competition for forest resources among timber industries. So as I already said before, more wood being diverted to biomass production means that less wood is being left for other timber manufacturers to use. The graph on the right side shows the annual timber harvest rates in South Korea. And as you can see that while the annual harvest rates are largely capped at a certain level, more and more biomass, the red bars, is eating into our overall timber supply, and that means that pulp industry, board industries are getting fewer and fewer wood resources, and that is disturbing the timber industry dynamics at large. Next. And lastly, we should not forget the role of civil society when it comes to inducing these government changes. There has been a series of reports exposing the implications and the impacts of excessive government support for forest biomass. I said again, media coverages, there has been a lot of campaigns going on at sites where the new power plants are getting built. Of course, local residents don't want more power plants to be built in their neighborhood. And all this momentum led to the increased advocacy for reduced support for forest biomass, including a couple of lawsuits directly targeting the biomass subsidy program. Next. So what does this all mean for the global forests? Let's just briefly talk about that and what needs to be done. Next, please. First of all, as I said, no more new biomass is allowed. And this means that South Korea as a society has reached a consensus on limiting the role of biomass in our carbon neutral future. Industry for a long time has claimed that biomass can play this role as a bridge fuel, but this clearly shows that even the energy ministry clearly implies that we have long crossed that bridge and we don't need more biomass. Next. And of course, this means that our imports of wood pellets will diminish in the long term, maybe not in the immediate because of the slow timelines for phase outs and phase downs and some loopholes and caveats, but in the longer term, the biomass industry at large, especially that in Southeast Asia, is facing diminished expectations for demand. So a lot of the industry stakeholders like to assume a perpetual government support for this industry, but this move that South Korea made tells that without government support, there won't be any more biomass. And the government is actually turning away, they're actually shifting away from this industry. So biomass industries in Southeast Asia, particularly those in Vietnam and Indonesia, which are key suppliers for South Korea's wood pellets, are likely to see this impact first because a lot of the volumes that are traded between these countries are on the spot market. Next. And of course, as I said again before, there's some downsides and shortfalls with this phase out and phase down timelines. This means that a lot of the power plants will continue to burn wood into 2030s and even 2040s until those power plants reach like 18 years or 20 years of age, and they basically live out their intended lifespan. So this is something that we need to address going forward. We need to phase out coal by mid-2030s, and biomass has to go out with coal. Next. And once again, promoting domestic forestry residues threatens forests in South Korea, and this will also intensify competition for domestic forest resources in the country, let alone the devastating ecological effects that we would see for a more aggressive clear cutting. Next. So this is the last slide I have here. This is a very important and symbolic move that puts an end to what it seemed to be the ever-growing tendency of the biomass industry in Asia. But the governments now need to adopt more ambitious phase-out timelines to make sure that these phase-outs happen as we're phasing out coal. And also, power utilities should take this reform as a clear signal to exit the biomass sector. There won't be as much government subsidies available to make this business profitable. And this is a very important signal, and the power plant operators should take this head on. And lastly, this also dramatically decreases the long-term prospects for investors and financiers as well, and they need to reevaluate their involvement in the biomass value chain. Other governments should take note of this South Korean government's recent changes in support for biomass energy, and hopefully we see changes like this happening more often throughout the Asian region. Next. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen into my presentation and this webinar. In general, all of this analysis are in our recent issue brief in more detail. So you can go check out our website and take a look at our issue brief and see what this policy change means to global forests and climate action across Asia. Thank you so very much.
はい。ハンセさん、発表ありがとうございました。細かいニュアンスとかですね、今後の課題、いい面だけではなくてですね、今後も、さらに評価が必要な、要素などもですね、お話しいただきまして、大変参考になりました。ありがとうございます。ここからですね、韓国の話とですね、比較して、世界の状況がどうなっているのかということで、アメリカ、そして日本のですね、状況などもですね、共有しながらコメントをいただきたいと思います。まずはじめに、我々地球人間環境フォーラムが、日頃からですね、協力しているアメリカの環境 NGO マイティアースのロジャー・スミスさんから、コメントと発表をいただきます。それでは、ロジャーさんお願いします。
Great, thank you very much. So my name is Roger Smith, and I direct Mighty Earth Japan work. And Mighty Earth is a global nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. that works on climate change and protecting global forests. I'm actually based in Japan, and I've worked on biomass since 2019. Last year, I worked with Tomari-san of the Biomass Industrial Society Network on a background document about air pollution violations and potential public health impacts related to wood pellet production in the southeastern United States. Large wood pellet mills are relatively new, and in the past, US state regulators didn't fully understand the level of pollution that such pellet plants emit. They let plants be built without sufficient pollution controls, especially for hazardous air pollutants and particulate matter, PM 2.5. And the two largest producers, Drax and Enviva, have had a history of violations of air pollution limits. That's what we did know. What we didn't know was what were the effects of this excess pollution on public health in the communities around the pellet mills, as that's something that hadn't been studied. So a year later, to provide an update, we're learning that fugitive dust is emerging as a point of concern. And in response to public complaints regarding it, the state of North Carolina set the first regulations of dust from pellet storage and shipping facilities at Enviva's Wilmington port facility. And then in August of this year, researchers at Brown University received a major federal grant to study air pollution and noise from wood pellet mills in the state of Mississippi. And then in December, researchers worked with community members to conduct a study of noise pollution related to the Drax Gloucester, Mississippi pellet mill and found high noise levels compared to a control community. The United States has provided tax incentives for renewable energy for the past 20 years. The Inflation Reduction Act changed the rules to qualify for the credits, and on January 7th, the government issued new guidance. So I won't read all the details, but what's significant is that biomass power plants using wood pellets are unlikely to qualify for this credit. Biomass plants need to have a life cycle greenhouse gas emission rate of 0 or less. And it's stated that just the energy used to make the pellets may make it impossible for biomass, particularly wood pellets, to qualify. So while most of the wood pellet production in the United States for export is in the Southeast, there's new proposed pellet mills for the Northwest and the West Coast. And these plants would be likely to ship their pellets to Japan. Each one of these plants also faces significant opposition from local residents and local and national environmental organizations. Golden State Natural Resources in California is currently in the public comment period for environmental impact, and the result of that will determine whether it moves forward. The first proposed pellet mill for Washington State, Pacific Northwest Renewable Energy, is also in a fight over pollution. Community groups and Earth Justice are appealing its air permit, alleging underestimation of air pollution based on the experience in the southeastern United States. Also in Washington State, Drax has proposed to build a pellet mill in Longview. However, its draft air permit has also been challenged for estimating hazardous pollution 100 times less than comparable facilities. Drax withdrew its air permit application and has yet to revise it. The Southwest Clean Air Agency also fined Drax in June for starting construction before permitting was completed and ordered a halt to construction. So finally, let me discuss the world's largest pellet producer, Enviva. Enviva recently emerged from Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and this is a legal process allowing a business to restructure and get permission to cancel debts and modify contracts. The restructuring plan cited numerous reasons for Enviva's financial trouble, many of which may also be shared by other pellet producers. To improve its financial situation, Enviva tried increasing pellet production. The restructuring plan stated that the company had challenges with increasing operational costs, competition for wood fiber raising prices, rising interest rates for their debt, and that price escalators in the contracts were set too low to cover actual cost increases. Also, Enviva had been aggressive in signing supply contracts before completing pellet mills. The plan noted that the company made up the gap between what it was obligated to provide and what it could produce by buying pellets on the spot market, which exposed it to risks. So the restructuring allows Enviva to renegotiate or cancel supply contracts that could not be profitably renegotiated. And when Enviva's customers lost money, they were allowed to file claims. So I reviewed the claims filed by Enviva's customers, and you can also see them at this link up top. If there's anything I missed or if there's something I misunderstood, please reach out to me. I'd really like to better understand the situation. So Mitsubishi Corporation had a secured claim for agreeing to defer shipments of biomass in exchange for a payment. The largest unsecured customer claims I found were by Sumitomo Corporation. One claim was for $319 million, and a second was for $59 million. These claims were both to compensate for the costs of having to find alternative fuel supply at a higher cost. Drax also filed a large claim for $75 million for Enviva's failure to deliver it pellets on time and at the agreed upon price. So the final reorganization plan, as amended on October 4th, was finally approved in December. In it, Enviva shareholders will get no recovery and be completely wiped out. For unsecured customer claims, such as those held by Sumitomo, there was only a small pool of money available to cover them, with an estimate of only a 7.5% recovery. And I estimate that would mean potentially a $350 million loss for Sumitomo. And finally, while Enviva had originally contemplated building 4 pellet mills near the Gulf of Mexico to ship pellets to Japan, only one of the plants now has funding to be completed, and that's in Epes, Alabama. Bond, Mississippi is on indefinite hold, and the other 2 plants, pellet mills, are presumably canceled. So to conclude, the biomass industry is entering a new stage after years of quick growth and easy profits. Policymakers in Korea and the United States are ending subsidies for biomass, in part due to its high greenhouse gas emissions. Even the largest producers like Enviva struggle to remain profitable while producing at scale, and we've seen their instability have a severe financial impact on their customers. So in light of these political, market, and environmental risks of wood biomass, I urge Japanese companies and the Japanese government to end their investments in and subsidies for wood biomass power. Thank you very much for your interest in today's presentation, and I'd be happy to answer questions here or via email. Thank you.
ロジャーさん、発表ありがとうございました。はい。日本のですね、バイオマス発電の、木質ペレットを輸入している商社とですね、最近は、昨年11月に、そういったエンビバ社のですね、ニュースが大きくなり出まして、はい。最新の情報ということでですね、お話しいただきました。次にですね、地球人間環境フォーラムの飯沼より日本の政策方についてですね、最新の情報を、お話しします。それでは飯沼さんよろしくお願いします。
ビデオが。はい。はい。すいません。よろしくお願いします。ちょっと待ってくださいね。で、はい。こちらで、共有できていますでしょうか。大丈夫ですか？すいません。鈴島さん、共有うまくいってますか？OK ですね。はい。ありがとうございます。はい。では、地球人間環境フォーラムの飯沼と申します。よろしくお願いします。私は森林関連で木材やパーム油のサプライチェーンに関わる、調査と政策提言や普及啓発などを担当しています。この5年ほどは主に輸入木質バイオマス発電の問題に取り組んでいて、特にフィット制度における持続可能性基準の引き上げを求める活動を行ってきました。タイトルスライドで今映していますのは、昨年12月に、今日の協力団体でもあるウータン森と生活を考える会が開始した、change.org というオンライン署名のページ、サイトのページです。 カナダの原生林を原料に作られた木質ペレットが、日本でバイオマス発電燃料として使われていることを、お知らせして、そこへのフィットの支援をまとめてくださいという依頼の署名ですけれども、1ヶ月少しで今1万7000人以上の方の署名をいただいているという、こういったこともご紹介したいと思います。今日は韓国の話を最初にしていただいたんですけれども、日本の状況を私から簡単にお伝えしたいと思います。日本のバイオマス発電所の地図ですけれども、これは2023年末のものですが、再生可能エネルギー固定価格買取制度 FIT による認定発電所の件数はだいたい1000件を超えました。このうち輸入の木質燃料を主に使っている一般木材というカテゴリーのものは179件、そのうち稼働しているものは95件です。バイオマスは伝統的に薪や炭などのエネルギー源として利用されてきました。エネルギー効率は熱利用の場合 60% から 70% に達するのですが、発電のみですと十数%から35% 程度にとどまります。つまり発電のみでは10本の木を燃やしても電気になるのは2、3本、残りの7、8本は熱として捨てているということになります。このように非効率なバイオマス発電が日本で急増した理由がそのフィット制度です。フィットの目的は環境負荷の低減、日本の競争力強化、産業振興、地域活性化、などなんですけれども、実際には効率が悪くて、CO2 排出量も多く、さらに燃料を輸入した場合には、競争力の強化にも産業の振興にも、地域活性化にも、効果は非常に限られると。そして、エネルギーの安全保障上もほとんどというか効果がありません。これがフィットの輸入木質バイオマスということになります。でフィットを支える再エネ賦課金は電気料金に上乗せして、電力消費者とか企業から徴収されて、それによってバイオマス電力も市場価格よりも高い価格で買い取られています。この賦課金制度がなくてはバイオマス発電はビジネスとしては成立しない。これは韓国と状況としては同じかなと思います。で日本の木質バイオマス発電の主な燃料は、木質ペレットと PKS、パーム角殻ですね。パームのヤシの種の殻です。油ヤシの。はい、でそれらの輸入量は急増しておりまして、このようにですね、急増しておりまして、木質ペレットに関しては過去、11年間で82倍に達しています。で昨年はもう580万トンを超えてしまったという状況です。で、特に2020年以降はですね、大型発電所の建設と運転開始が相次いでいるため、輸入量も急増しているという状況です。で主な輸入先はベトナム、カナダ、アメリカです。特に2023年度はですね、米国からの輸入が、4倍に急増してカナダに並ぶ、量に近づいてきました。一方、農産物残差である PKS は生産量に限界があります。木質ペレットも持続可能性を考慮して製材廃材のみを使った場合は増加にはかなり限度があるはずなのですが、今のところ輸入の勢いは衰えていません。これは私たちが以前から、フィットのガイドライン改定などにあたって資源エネルギー庁などへ提言してきた内容です。バイオマスの、燃焼時の排出も含めてパリ協定の 1.5 度目標を達成し得る、GHG グリーンハウスガス排出量であること、それから、生産地での課題への対応、その内容と方法、特にトレーサビリティの確保ですね。それからデューデリジェンスの実施、そして持続可能性の確保のためには、木材を木材として長く使い、エネルギー利用は最終手段とするカスケード利用、特にマテリアルとしての利用を最大限行うと。それから地産地消、熱利用優先などを挙げています。で、フィットのバイオマス発電では、 この2017年からガイドラインが策定されておりまして、持続可能性に関するガイドラインが策定されて、毎年更新されています。で、特に輸入木質バイオマスに関する部分では、燃料の安定調達について協定等を締結することを求めています。しかし、近年の円安や先ほどの塩ビバの倒産、アメリカでの、北米ですね、北米での違法行為、多数の違法行為の発覚、ベトナムでの森林認証の偽装など、海外からの輸入に関して安定調達というのは非常に困難な状況になっています。で、今年度はですね、このガイドラインに新たに、流通経路、トレーサビリティの確認ということが追加されました。これは私たち求めてきたことなんですけれども、現状では事業者にトレーサビリティを確認することを求めているのみで、情報公開の義務がないので、実際にはあまり意味がありません。で、フィットでは、また当初より持続可能性、合法性が証明された木材製品を用いることを求めてきたんですけれども、具体的にはどのような内容を求めているのかが不明確でした。で、これが、2024年には、持続可能性、合法性を担保する第三者認証の、名前、固有の識別番号、認証燃料の量などをホームページで公開するという項目が新たに追加されました。しかしこれもですね、やっぱり先ほどのトレーサビリティと同じで、法令、遵守をしていない、現地生産地との関連がこれではわからない、たどることができません。そこで私たちとしてはこれに関しては加工場のリスト、ペレットミルですとかパームオイルのミルですねの、リストの公開というのを求めています。発電事業者がサプライチェーン上の法令遵守違反を知った場合、経産省に報告改善すること、違反が継続する場合はサプライチェーンを再構築することという、これは法令違反に対応する文言というのも前回追加されたんですけれども、これもですね、発電事業者の自己申告に依存している状態で、実際にはですね、法令違反の燃料があると報告されて言われているところからも来ている。しかし来ている、どこから来て、どこが使っているのかわからないために、利用されている可能性は十分にあるんですけれども、それが把握できないという状況です。はい。なので、なかなか実質的に合法性や持続可能性を確認できているのかというと、かなり疑わしいというか、できていないんじゃないかというふうに考えています。情報公開についてもですね、既存のものに関しては、自主的な、情報公開を求めているだけですので、昨年末に初めて発電事業者の業界団体による、情報公開がありましたけれども、生産国情報の開示は95社中6社にとどまりました。ということで、これもやはり非常に不十分な状況であります。で、このように日本ではですね、これまでバイオマス発電の持続可能性に関する議論が繰り返されて、ガイドラインの改定も毎年更新されてきたんですけれども、その内容はというと、バイオマスの燃焼による CO2 排出量はカウントしないとか、すでに認定を受けた発電所は規制の対象とはしないですとか、確認方法、持続可能性の確認方法も、認証制度に依存しているなど、なかなか根本的な対策を取ろうとしてきたとは言えないと思います。さまざまに指摘されている輸入木質バイオマスの生産地での課題、あるいはバイオマスを燃やすことそのものの課題、気候変動の解決になるのかといった課題に、なかなか対応できていないというふうに言えると思います。一方で韓国の方は、これまで持続可能性基準というものを作ってこなかったわけですけれども、先日、先ほどの話にあったように、非常に、私たちも驚いたんですけれども、急にそういった、新しい、政策の方針をですね、変えたということが起きました。で、それは森林破壊や CO2 排出に対する批判を、受け止めて、非常に劇的な政策転換という方針を打ち出したと言えます。このような転換でも本当に世界中の関係者は結構驚いたんじゃないかなと思います。 で、最後にですね、すみません、ちょっと伸びてますけれども、こちらも、昨年末に入ってきた情報なんですけれども、国連のバイオマスに関して、国連の政策投資原則、PRI では、気候と自然に対する EU のバイオマスエネルギー政策及び投資リスクへの対応と題する政策レポートを発表しました。それはですね、そのエネルギーとしての木質バイオマスへの依存は、気候緩和、適応、自然再生、生物多様性、循環型バイオ経済にとって重大な政策リスク、そしてネットゼロ移行投資に関連するリスクをもたらすというふうに言っています。そして、政策の優先順位と政策決定者への提言として、木材は希少で価値があるものである。で、一次林業バイオマスのエネルギー利用の奨励は避ける。ですとか、森林の炭素貯蔵以外にも生物多様性とかバイオエコノミーなどのへの素材提供のために森林の価値を最大化するですとか、エネルギーのためのバイオマスから気候と自然の課題を解決するための森林へと政策を転換すると、こういったことが言われています。そして EU レッド3といわれる再生エネルギー指令において、エネルギーのためのバイオマスには上限を設定するですとか、炭素吸収源および土地利用とか土地利用変化および林業の目標におけるバイオマスを優先する。それからエネルギー用一次バイオマスに対する財政支援および奨励金を撤廃するですとか、バイオマス利用に関する温室効果ガス算定を調和させるとか、そういったことが、そしてカスケード利用ですね、の原則、高価値のバイオマス利用を確保するなどですね、非常に厚みのある、この、政策レポートです。これもここにリンクも入れてますので、ぜひご覧いただきたいんですけれども、生きた森林そのものがもたらす恩恵と価値、木材を切って燃やして、二酸化炭素を代替するということだけではなくて、森林がもたらすそのものの価値を認識して、バイオマスのエネルギー利用増大に釘を刺したというふうに言えると思います。非常にこういったレポートを見てですね、バイオマス発電を、日本にも大きな示唆を与えているものだと思います。バイオマス発電を再生可能エネルギーと位置づけて、このまま賦課金、補助金を出し続けるのか、それとも気候変動と自然環境の保全に本当に役に立つ森林の活用とは何かを改めて考えるのか、それを問われているのは日本の私たちかなと思います。以上です。ありがとうございました。
今さん、発表ありがとうございました。はい。じゃあこれからですね、終了の5時半終了までに、皆さんからいただいた質問の方にですね、ご回答、相談者の皆さんからご回答していきたいというふうに思います。はい。時間も限られておりますので、関連性のですね、高いものから、お答えしていきたいと思います。中には基本的な用語説明についてもですね、お願いする質問がありましたので、またよろしくお願いいたします。はい。ではですね、順番に、4時、4時19分のハンセさんへの質問でですね、はい、REC の価格補助効果により、発電用原料とリサイクル原料の競合が起きているというふうに説明されましたが、もう少し説明をお願いします。このリサイクル原料とは何を指していますかというご質問です。
Thank you so much for that question. I think it's a very important point because the timber industry and the market dynamics have their own way of having their prices determined by the supply and demand. And the REC weightings are artificial government intervention to those market dynamics. And if they're not designed and implemented properly, it could lead to side effects. So in Korea, there are two markets for two types of markets where these competitions are happening. The first one is the competition between this unused forest biomass and the feedstocks that the board industry and the pulp industries use. So there's one, and the other one is between the wood pellets made of waste wood from like construction sites or discarded furniture. So those waste wood and the recycling industry that use the same wood to recycle into other low value products. So these are two different markets. So whether it's for primary forest biomass or for secondary woody biomass, this is where the competitions are happening. And basically the how it happens is quite similar because of these REC subsidies that power plants basically, there are subsidies that award the biomass power producers. The power producers can procure these feedstocks at higher prices, whereas other timber industries don't have the subsidies, so they have to procure the feedstocks at the usual prices. So the wood pellet producers can procure biomass, can procure wood at higher prices and sell that wood to the pellet producers and sell that to power plants at higher prices. So that's how it basically happens, and it is happening in terms of both secondary woody biomass and primary woody biomass. I hope it makes sense.
はい、ありがとうございます。ではですね、次の順番でいきたいと思いますけれども、4時21分のご質問で、これもハンセさんですけれども、韓国のですね、再エネ証書は他国に比べて高く、発行量も少ないために、調達が困難な状況ですが、今後ますますこの状況に拍車がかかるという見通しでしょうかというご質問です。
I think there's a whole market situations with the RPS policy and the number of RECs issued placed in the market has to do more with the overall renewable energy landscape in Korea rather than just biomass, because biomass takes up a lot of the a quite significant portion in the RPS market, but also there's solar, wind, and other renewable sources as well. And one important thing is that the South Korean government is currently implementing some significant changes to the RPS system. They're gradually transitioning RPS into the auction-based, market-based bidding system. So the role of the RPS in the overall renewable energy market will gradually decrease. And the Energy Ministry has said that they will decrease the number of fossil fuel power plants that are required to, they're basically mandated with RPS. They're going to shrink that and make more of the auction-based bidding market in the future. So it's more complex than just the biomass and number of RECs issued. And the important thing is that I don't think there will be a lot of auction or bidding happening with biomass now that the government has made it clear that they're not going to do any biomass anyways. So yeah, the RPS will be gradually becoming less important down the road.
はい、ありがとうございます。ではですね、次は、次の質問で4時22分の質問です。韓国の公営発電所と民間発電所は自由競争の関係にあるのですか？消費者には選択の自由はあるのですかというご質問です。
First of all, the public does not have the freedom to choose from where they want to buy their electricity. It's all bundled into the nationwide grid, and we don't really get to choose what electricity producer we want to buy the electricity from. So in that sense, there may be, of course, competition between public and private power plants, but I think it's more complicated and nuanced. And this issue with the transparency of where our electricity comes from remains to be a significant issue in South Korea.
はい、ありがとうございます。では次は、4時30分のご質問があります。日本の発電所は20年、日本のですね、フィット制度の補助は20年間ありますが、REC は毎年更新され、いきなりなくなるということで良いのでしょうかと、そういうことでしょうかと。また、REC 見直しの背景について、エネルギーミックスが変わってきたということが背景ということですが、足元ですね、大型発電所がなくなってきたことなども要因としてあったりするのでしょうか。混焼について REC がなくなると、バイオマスではなく他のもので石炭と混焼していくということになるのでしょうかというご質問です。
Thank you so much for the question. I think you mentioned a couple of very important points that I didn't get to talk about actually during my presentation due to time constraints. First of all, REC ratings in South Korea are revised every 3 years. So the government has this regular revision cycle. And this 2024 was one of those years. And in leading up to 2024, there has been a lot of industry lobbying, a lot of campaigns around this momentum. And of course, the energy ministry tends to represent the power sector interest, big coal power plants, small coal power plants, the businesses that are already in the power sector. So in the past, the government didn't even touch any of the weightings, REC weightings for existing power fleet. While we think this is such a significant step, last year in 2024 was that the government for the first time decided to implement changes that would affect the profit of the existing privately owned power plants despite the backlashes from the power sector. That also leads to an important analysis because there are not many new power plants, biomass power plants getting built in South Korea. I think that would make that made our energy ministry MOTI to make the decision rather easily because the overall market situations and the prospects of the biomass industry, as Roger mentioned, are not good at all. So this probably left some pressure off of MOTI's shoulders when it comes to implementing these changes. And of course, also, as I mentioned, this delayed timelines for phase down and phase out also in reality still protects the power sector's interest quite a bit. So while it's a symbolic first step in the right direction, when it comes to the actual overall reduction of the support for biomass, there's still a bit of a way to go. And of course, we want to see these existing power plants diminish as soon as possible. I don't know if I answered all the questions.
はい、ありがとうございます。では次の、質問で、4時30分の質問があるんですけれども、今回の韓国の政策変更が、ベトナム等のですね、東南アジア、ベトナム等の、ペレット生産国に与える影響といったものはどのような影響が考えられますかというご質問です。
So as I briefly mentioned during the presentation, I don't have any data or numbers or statistics to back this up, but I don't think there will be a dramatic decrease in the imports from anywhere in the next couple of years because there's a grace period for this all phase downs and phase outs to kick in. And there, we also have actually have 2 power plants that are in the pipeline. They're very close to becoming online. So if those 2 come online, it will inevitably import more wood pellets from Southeast Asia. So there still will be demand. But another important thing to point out is that the volumes of wood pellets that South Korea imports every year are actually on the decrease in the longer term. Like, for example, like, I'm not sure if it was compared to 2022 in 2023 or the year after that, but for the first time in like 5 or 6 years, we saw a drop in decrease of wood pellets, especially from Vietnam, because of the increase of domestically produced wood pellets within South Korea. So I expect to see this trend continue. We don't necessarily, the market trend shows that we don't necessarily see a huge spike in imports. But again, as I said, these power plants that are in the pipeline are the variables that we have to take into account. And of course, those power plants might turn to domestic forest residues. So that's something that we have to see.
はい、ありがとうございます。では次の質問で、4時35分の質問で、言葉の定義を教えてくださいという質問がありましたが、韓国における一般バイオマスと未利用バイオマスの、定義を教えてくださいというご質問です。
So that's a very good question. The definition of unused biomass is inherently very problematic because other timber industries say that those are actually used biomass. They had been using those feedstocks for quite some time to make particle boards or to make pulp for paper. So the term is inherently misleading, but when it comes to scope and definition, I say it's rather arbitrary. So if the logging happens for fire prevention or for roadside accident prevention, or if it happens even for development projects, land use changes, in some cases, only the wood that cannot be used for other purposes, so like twigs and small round wood, is classified as forest residues or unused biomass. But in other cases, even the whole logs can be categorized as unused biomass. So where this decision happens is usually in the field by the operators and by the loggers are very arbitrary, and there's a lot of issues with transparency and traceability of this unused forest biomass, and they often get mixed in, allegedly, with roundwood at the wood pellet or chip factories. So we see this as a big problem. The Forestry Service is working on improving these traceability issues, but as long as the subsidies are there, the financial motives are there to source as much unused biomass as possible, I think it's going to be hard to fix this problem completely.
はい、ありがとうございます。では、次の質問に行きたいと思いますが、次、大事な質問として、4時41分の質問で、韓国で国産リンチ残材の REC が維持されることによって、輸入の PKS を増やすことになるというふうに言及されましたが、理由を聞き逃していたので、再度、教えてくださいというご質問です。
It's not necessarily the maintaining of the current high REC weightings for domestic forest residues or unused biomass that could increase the demand for PKS. I think it's the decrease in subsidies for imported wood pellets that PKS could benefit from that because the REC weightings for PKS would remain the same. So it's just It's just an assumption, but we will have to see how it actually plays out in the market.
はい、ありがとうございます。はい。では、いくつか日本に関する質問、日本のバイオマス燃料の利用状況についての質問もあるので、状況のうちですね、飯沼さんなども、回答していただければと思いますが、4時42分の質問で、はい、日本における国産リンチ残材、バイオマス利用の他産業との競合は、同じく製質材を使う製紙業界が主です。製材などの溶剤との競合はほとんど起きていませんと。で、韓国との違いは REC 含めて、補助されている額、バイオマス燃料で補助されている額の違いでしょうかと。そのあたりの分析があればお教えくださいというご質問ですが、はい。これは回答できそうでしょうか。
これは韓国に関する質問だと思いますけど。
はい。製材、韓国で製材とバイオマス燃料とのですね、競合が起きている、理由、要因といったところですかね。はい。REC による補助額が、そういった製材とバイオマス燃料との競合を引き起こしているのかというご質問だと思います。ハンセさん、何かありますでしょうか。
Yes, in Korea, it's largely because of the exceeding amounts of subsidies that biomass can receive from these unused forest biomass feedstocks. And I said before that really makes the playing field uneven for other timber industries to compete. The wood pellet producers that are subsidized, the timber industries are not subsidized. So that's the inherent difference. And of course, it disturbs the cascading use principles of wood a lot. High value wood goes to biomass, and this is not the kind of market dynamics that we want to see. Not sure if that's the same case in Japan. Maybe that's the difference in the scale of subsidies or the structural differences in the forestry sector, but I'll leave that up to Inuma-san to answer.
はい、ありがとうございます。では、ちょっと残り時間も少なくなり始めましたので、大事な質問からですね、ピックアップしていきたいと思います。はい。5時9分のご質問で、海外から輸入されですね、ヤシ殻 PKS のバイオマス発電の利用においても、今後状況は変わっていきますか、変わっていくと思いますかというご質問です。
I'm not quite sure if I can answer that with the knowledge and data that we have now. There hasn't been as much issue raising and noises around the PKS imports or other plant-based biomass material imports in South Korea. If there are issues with like land use change in Indonesia or deforestation because of palm oil plantations, yes, there might be changes, but that's something that we'll have to see in the future.
じゃあ、ここはちょっと私からも一言、付け加えさせていただきます。はい、PKS に関しては、パームカーネルシェルですね、に関しては、日本も 韓国もまだ輸入量が非常に多いんですけれども、ちょっとまだこれは不確定なことが多いですが、インドネシア自体がですね、かなりやっぱりバイオマス発電とかバイオマスのエネルギー利用を増やしていこうとしています。で、こういった政策が、インドネシアもかなり急に政策を変えたりとかですね、することがありますので、そういったことは大きくな影響を及ぼしてくる可能性はあるんじゃないかなとは思いますけれども、基本的に海外に輸出する方が今のところ高いので、こちらに来てますけれども、やっぱりその国内での再エネ推進ということに大きく舵を切られると急変するということはあるかもしれません。あとインドネシアは最近ですね、こういった、エネルギー消費ですとか、食料生産も含めて、新たにですね、今後その2000万ヘクタールという非常に大規模な森林開発を強要するというような報道がありましたので、やっぱり今回韓国が大きな方針変更をしたきっかけも、やっぱりインドネシアのそういった熱帯林から熱帯林を伐採されて作られているペレットの、そういったレポートの影響とかもあったと思うんですけれども、やはりやっぱり世界の森林と連動しているんだと、森林の状況に私たちのこういった政策が非常に大きな影響を与えているということを意識して、生産国で何が起きているかということを見ていただきたいなと思います。
はい、ありがとうございます。はい。では次のご質問で、はい。これはちょっとアメリカの状況に関わると思いますけども、バイオマス発電の問題の課題や対応について、米国でトランプ政権となることによって、どういったですね、状況の変化があり得るのかというご質問です。はい。おそらくこれはアメリカでのバイオマス産業、ペレット産業の見通しについての質問だと思いますが、ロジャーさん、何か今後の見通しについてありますでしょうか。
Well, I think today is the day of inauguration in the US, so it's a little bit early to say anything very definitively. In general, the wood pellet industry wasn't really created by US government policy or subsidy. It's really for export. So I think the important thing is what are the policies in the countries that are consuming the pellets. And if Korea, Japan, or other countries begin to reject biomass or can no longer afford it, then I suspect the U.S. pellet industry would collapse or certainly not be able to continue to grow. I also don't think the biomass industry is particularly politically powerful or connected in the United States compared to, say, natural gas or other parts of the energy sector. So again, this is a guess, but I think protecting it or supporting it would be fairly low on the agenda of the incoming Trump administration.
はい、ありがとうございます。はい。もう時間があと1分少しになって2分切ってしまいましたので、最後の質問をどれか一つ、ピックアップしたいと思います。はい。そうですね。はい。5時17分の質問ですね、英語で書かれているんですけれども、はい。do you think that South Korea's new policy or negative stance on biomass could serve as a cautionary example for other countries? Is there any possibility that the Japanese government might follow a similar path?
I think this question is for Inuma-san.
すいません、ごめんなさい。今ちょっと回答していて、聞き逃してしまったんですけど、ペグパッドさんの質問ですか。
5時17分の質問で、はい。韓国政府のですね、この政策というものが、
はいはい。
他の国にとって、 警告的な例になるのかということで、日本政府がですね、こういった同じ道筋を取ることがあるのかということですね。可能性について。
私たちとしてはそれはそうなってほしいと、しかももう少しスピードアップしてっていうふうには希望するところではありますけれども、おそらくそんな簡単ではないかと思います。日本はこれまでその先ほど申し上げたように持続可能性基準をさまざまなことをですね、やってきた、それが効果があるかどうかは別としてそういったことを積み重ねてきてはいますので、そういった大転換というような大きな政策変換というのは、日本はあまり、そういったことは通常行わないのが普通で、やっぱり業界への配慮とかですね、業界の意見を聞くというのが一番最初に日本がやることですので、今回のような韓国がやったようなことをすぐにフォローするということは、私たちはちょっと考えられないかなと思っています。
はい、ありがとうございました。まだまだですね、ご回答できていない質問があるのですけれども、本日はですね、時間の都合上、こちらで、以上とさせていただきたいと思います。はい。本日はですね、ハンセさんに韓国の大きな政策変更についてお話しいただき、ありがとうございました。このですね、情報を、日本国内でも広めて、あるいは先ほどロジャーさんからですね、アメリカという、日本がたくさん輸入している生産地のでのですね、将来の供給不安とか、現地のですね、ペレット産業の、リスクみたいなのもお話していただきまして、さまざまな観点ですね、環境の面からも、あるいはその経済性の観点からもですね、今後、バイオマスがですね、本当にこれほどの、大規模なですね、形で発電に使っていくことが持続可能なのかどうかということをですね、今後も日本向けに情報を世界の時代とですね、世界の NGO と協力して提供していきたいなというふうに思っています。はい、本日はご参加いただきありがとうございました。これにて終了させていただきます。
どうもありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。はい。では、一旦閉じまして、また後ほどですね、